whenever I give a talk, and I think it was from San Francisco and then Trivandrum, in the back of my mind, I hear Jean-Luc Dumont on my shoulder telling me what not to do in a presentation. So I will do my best to avoid all of the pitfalls that he had outlined. And I'll do my best to resist the temptation for the obvious traps, but I'm sure to transgress along the way. So by now, we know what city, or we should know what city we are in, and we know why we are in this room. So I won't bother repeating that. When Dwayne, Bibby, and I started corresponding about the logo of the conference hall, I did ask for one small Easter egg to be put in the logo. And I don't know if anyone has bothered to hunt it down or pick it up. There is one critical aspect of this city that many of you still may not know. And any takers on what the Easter egg is? Bottom left corner. Oh, it's more than a fish. How do you pronounce the name of this fair city? Toronto. Rhymes like piranha. So if you end up at Canadian Customs and you say, I'm on my way to Toronto, my good man, they're not going to believe you. It's Toronto, it sounds like piranha. The inspiration for the canvas and the painting style comes from the Group of Seven, a very influential group of Impressionist painters. And those of you who are on the excursion on Friday will get to experience some of that, both the physical landscape of Georgian Bay and the painting. Two of my favorite are A.J. Kesson and Lauren Harris. And Dwayne was kind enough to indulge me and incorporate that style into the logo. This year at the Build Conference, Microsoft's Build Conference, and let me just say, and Carl will vouch for me, that never, ever, ever in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine that I would open a conference talk by referencing Microsoft and its CEO. But Satya Nadella used a very interesting turn of phrase. He spoke of conversational canvases. And just that kind of blew me away, because I have struggled. I mean, many of us in this room began in Usenet days and progressed through various incarnations of social media or communications. But conversational canvases really took my breath away. Kevin, I guess, is still sleeping. Kevin Larson from Microsoft is going to give a talk today, and I'm really delighted that he could make it. When I looked at the Microsoft Advanced Typography website and I was hunting down someone to speak to at the conference, the website looked like it had been screen scraped off a Windows 97 screen, and my old Tektronix 4010s had higher resolution than that. So thankfully that has improved. But it was a happy day when I did hear back from Microsoft and then from Kevin directly. But back to canvases. What is this canvas that Satya was talking about? The buzz nowadays is the Internet of Things. Not only network-enabled devices, but intelligent bots enabled by cloud-based machine learning, augmented reality, virtual reality. When I thought about it some more, I began to suspect that what he was really referring to had more to do with modes of interaction, that the canvas across all of these interactions had a common element. That is, in Microsoft speak, the mobile-first, cloud-first vision, the device had become the canvas, and we're all too familiar with that. But is it really a canvas? When over-the-air TV ruled the continent's airwaves, if one were to switch from CBS News, for instance, with its exquisite branding under the guidance of Lou Dorfsman, who was involved in the selection and evolution of the CBS version of the Dido font, which now unfortunately has been removed from their branding, to ABC's Wide World of Sports. Did we refer to it as a different canvas? Or was it simply different content utilizing the same canvas, namely the television? However you might consider the distinction between canvas and content, the question remains, what sort of activities does this canvas enable and encourage? And there are three prominent ones for the conversational canvas. It's collaboration, cooperation, and sometimes confrontation, as we know. So these new world canvases would then be Facebook, Twitter, Skype, WhatsApp, Slack, GroupMe, OwnCloud, email, or any of the other bewildering range of choices. They're all marked by a cacophony of voices, each clamoring to interject the next riposte and make a mark. Here, the canvas can also be seen as a viewport for the race to acquire the largest number of users as quickly as possible. We attribute virtue to the canvas not by its content, but rather by its viability. So a declining or even steady user base is taken as a mark of irrelevance. So in the immortal words of perhaps the greatest of modern worldly philosophers, if you ain't first, you're last. Ricky Bobby, Talladega Nights. And since we are so dependent on at least the first two activities, collaboration and cooperation, it is natural to put so much emphasis on these conversational canvases. Plus, who amongst us, look at how many devices are in the room, who amongst us can resist the siren call of shiny new technology and what it might represent for our needs and aspirations? And our innate desire to be acknowledged for being at the vanguard of the future. Indeed, it is reflected in the very names given to the gatherings where these are showcased, or as company mottos. For instance, Microsoft has a build conference, HP used it, Invent, Raspberry, Maker Faire. It is an expression of our creative impulse into something tangible, whether it's a woodworking project or a new tablet PC. But if this is the main attraction of the Big Top, with its barkers and colored balloons, to quote Neil Young, what is happening behind the tent? In other words, is that all there is? There is another stage, there is another type of human activity that merits mentioning, and it's the world where most of us live, and that's the activity of discovery. So behind the illusion of spectacle, and behind the curtain that forms the backdrop of the glitz and glamour of the stage, is that activity of discovery. This endeavor is lonelier, the path more difficult. The effort expended can span many years, even decades, with little in the form of assurance that a positive outcome awaits the supplicant. And even if you're mostly right, or even completely right, someone else might still beat you to the punch. Acknowledgement of great achievement is rarely resounding in this domain. Working here can often feel like pushing on a string. Think of the connection that takes you from the discovery of the mathematics of conic sections to Kepler's work on planetary motion to NASA's Apollo mission. This is the 47th anniversary of Apollo 11, one of the most compelling endeavors in recent time. And on Twitter, if you haven't had a chance, they broadcasted communication by communication. Discovery is the driving force behind research, both pure and applied. It spans the fields of science, mathematics, medicine, and technical fields such as engineering. In this vast domain, there too is a common canvas. Here it's the page. The page holds court. Even if we don't know for how long, the primacy of the page is unquestioned in this dominion. And the page is the ideal canvas for using tech. For tech has an unequaled ability to express complex ideas using the specific notations and syntactic constraints required by these fields. The rarest of cuneiforms, along with their most pedantic rules of layout, can all be handled easily with TeX. Even after all these years, it is able to adapt to the natural language of the domain rather than force the language to conform to its limitations. This canvas, in contrast to the conversational canvases, and perhaps only because conversational canvases are evolving so rapidly, has a natural order. We may still be in the process of abstracting overarching rules of representation in those electronic canvases. And here I'm thinking, for instance, of Twitter Bootstrap, which has gone quite a ways in consolidating some of those rules. But that is something for the future. Thanks to another one of our special guests, we're able to talk about proportion and spacing to arrive at a much deeper understanding of what constitutes beauty on this canvas. Just think of it. We can speak of beauty with a common appreciation. What an amazing thing to share. Robert Bringhurst will be speaking tomorrow, and we all know him from pretty seminal works. Now for the cartoon, which I inadvertently put in. Robert, when we were corresponding, asked me, I need to learn a little bit more about TeX. Well, this is part of a cartoon about programming languages. Can everyone read it? It says, "Your paper makes no goddamn sense, but it's the most beautiful thing I've ever laid eyes on." And sometimes, even if we don't understand the context, TeX has made it beautiful. But is even discovery all there is? The more appropriate question might be whether the activity of discovery qualifies as Aristotle's unmoved mover, so to speak. Sorry, Robert, I forgot to mention this book. I pre-ordered it. Everyone else should too. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be huge. Getting back to what comes behind discovery. So there is an even more isolating endeavor than discovery, and it is contemplation, which in turn feeds its near neighbors intuition, inspiration, and interpretation. This is the most solitary of endeavors, and the practitioner must traverse a vastly more barren landscape and climb the slope and try to pierce the cloud of unknowing. The artist must confront their own self-doubt when faced with that blank page, the blank stone, the blank canvas surface. And I quote Colette, "The writer who loses his self-doubt, who gives way as he grows old to a sudden euphoria, to prolixity, should stop writing immediately. The time has come for him to lay aside the pen." And what of this canvas? What tools might be used to express our ideas on this canvas, where contemplation is the activity? This is how we landed up on one of the themes of this conference, which you will find on the pens that are part of the registration kit. The theme is pen to print, trying to map the arch between the original idea to the work that Tim does to produce beautiful books. It acknowledges the connection between artist and artisan that allow enduring works of art to be created. The source of an idea often has its earliest expression in ink. We were privileged yesterday to have visited Tim and Elka's unique printing house, Porcupine's Quill. Craft and quality should never be taken for granted. Coming back to the pen itself, there's a sentimental reason why you are holding boxes from the Garland Pen Company of Providence, Rhode Island. TUG was founded in Providence, and I think we are here today because of what TUG means to us individually and collectively. Some of you may notice that there are 3 fonts used on the inscription, and the M dash is shown in code. Carl guided me on the value of this. That is the triple dash in tech, of course. That's the M dash. In this audience, this is akin to having used Comic Sans in all its garish glory when putting out the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But here too, there is a small puzzle to tickle the mind. The font family here, used here, is Lucida, and I only wish Chuck and Chris were here directly so we could acknowledge them and call them out in person, but Chuck is coming tomorrow, Chuck Bigelow. The first line, identifying the conference, is done in Lucida Grand DK, am I correct? Which is dedicated to Donald Knuth, and it acknowledges the essential step that to get from the handwriting font in the word pen to the book font used in the word print, the content must be coded. Carl and I also used the province rather than the country to draw extra attention to the distinction between the letter O and the digit 0. So 2016, Toronto, T-O-R-O-O, Ontario, lots of O's in there to compare for us OCD folks. Sheila here, Michael, she can diagnose our OCD behavior directly. I also put in my title, Passport. I've spoken at length of canvases and over which these canvases, text particular and powerful expressiveness, still has sway. Let me talk about the passport. These days, it has become an ID document, something that identifies the holder as who they are. A means to get through ever tighter security when entering an airport, boarding a plane, or crossing over a border. It's treated as a gateway key. GPG will have a field day one day with passport. But to me, a passport conjures up a much more romantic image of a far more innocent time. It speaks of exotic lands and people on faraway shores, of adventurous travels and the chance to shed our skins of the familiar patterns of daily life, as we do when we visit TUG conferences all over the world. To stand in awe of unfamiliar vistas and know with certainty that they will form indelible impressions upon the backdrop of our memories. At its essence, a passport allows us to regale in the stories of others, and by doing so, connect to our own to theirs. And to my mind, that's all there really is. We are both made of and then defined by our own stories. When I speak about the passport to the tech canvas, I'm talking about TUG. I think of TUG not so much as an organization, but as a collection of conversations, of talks given formally as part of the conferences such as this one, but more importantly, discussions carried on in the margins. Conversational canvases bristle with activity, exciting and sometimes enraging the participants, even as they sit silent in electronic isolation. In contrast, the tech canvas, the page, which demands of the reader quiet, concentrated effort, can allow the same reader to escape their noisy and boisterous surroundings, the very opposite of electronics. As it did with me late into the night on Rue Sainte-Catherine in Montreal, which was overflowing with revelers, and where I found myself in an open-to-the-street cafe reading Northrop Frye's Myth and Metaphor. This canvas, the page, without the transactional pull from advertisements, interjecting themselves, allows us to soar alongside the stories into our imagination. So let me talk a little bit about a story, a particular story. Shortly after my first TUG visit, I went to Braille to attend the context meeting. Pavel one of the organizers, as a parting gift, gave me this bag. On it is written the Karlovy Vary International Film Festival.
Yeah.
I had no idea the context. I just loved the type and I loved the bag. I'll pass it around with me. So let me go back to a story. A few months later, I was taking some training in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was sitting at a table, heads down. Had to do with 3D projector technology. Nothing to do with typesetting. I was working on an assigned problem, and this bag was beside me on the table. And all of a sudden, I heard a voice beside me. Did you enjoy Karlovy Vary? Actually, I had no idea what was precisely said, because it took the gentleman several times to pierce my concentration. It was so out of context. I turned around. I found a giant of a man. I would easily be dwarfed by him. Perfect for linebacker or offensive line. And his voice had this very pleasant southern drawl. And it took another few attempts by him for me to really understand he was talking about the bag. Well, he went on to explain that he grew up in rural Georgia, ended up marrying a Czech woman, and his father-in-law has a property in Karlovy Vary. And this man, along with his family, spent a portion of each summer in the Czech Republic. And he spoke fluent Czech, along with a beautiful southern drawl of English. And we got started talking about typesetting in context of what I was doing in Braille. And the art scene in and around Prague, the glass scene. What an extraordinary conversation it led to. Lest you think that all stories come this easily, let me tell you of another chance encounter on the same trip and a missed opportunity. I was at home of a family member, and they took delivery of some furniture. On the truck was a company named Grissom. Now, I imagine that many of us were mesmerized by the Apollo 11 mission. But for me, the Apollo astronaut who somehow caught my imagination was Gus Grissom, who died tragically on the launch pad on Apollo 1. I think it was because he had an engineering background as opposed to a pilot's background, although he was a pilot. And also, there's hardly a photograph in the NASA archives where he hasn't got this infectious smile. Well, I mentioned this to one of the delivery people who was bringing in the furniture, that there was a high school, which I knew of in Alabama, dedicated to Gus Grissom. Well, this gentleman didn't recognize the name, but wishing, I think, to continue on with the conversation, mentioned that the moving company belonged to his uncle, Marquis Grissom. And I didn't recognize that name. But I should have, since Marquis Grissom played for the Montreal Expos. And a thorough class act. So here we are, telling our stories, passing by each other. If only I had stopped and asked him more about his uncle. Stories are around us, and they can bind us together in kinship. It is the hope of the conference organizers that TUG act as a magnet, and the bag that each of you have received, the messenger bag, act as a repository to many new and wonderful stories, and that it may inspire some of you to put at least some of those stories down on the tech canvas for others to enjoy. Welcome to TUG 2016. Good for time? Do you want to?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. I'm going to invite Geoffrey Poore up for our first talk, Advances in PythonTeX. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes. And those who are attending the workshop can follow Sue and Cheryl out to the workshop area, please. Yes. Well, I didn't know whether we would start on time, so.
we can test the AV for real.
Yes.
I'm just so, and Jeff, I just have these little things for 5 minutes, 1 minute. And then my program back.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Jeff, can I forgot the one last detail. Sorry. Just need to.
You need to plug it back in?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Just 30 seconds. Most of you know that I put the conference photographs as albums on this website, on our personal server domain, tug.chronicles.endeavorhouse.org. It does require username and password. The double backslash is necessary. And I encourage you to look at it, browse on it, and if there are any questions, we can always revisit the details in a break or at the end of the conference. Yes, Jim.
Since we're in Cabbage Town, I found it appropriate, especially the first part of your talk, that it was here at the University of Toronto. I realized it's not the high school next door. Across the street with the other one, the bigger one. That Marshall McLuhan did most of this work.
Yes,
Which of course informed much of your talk.
That's right.
The first half of your talk.
that's right. Yes, absolutely. Does everyone know Marshall McLuhan? Yeah. I would prefer to reference Northrop Frye, but I'll accept your input. Any other comments? Sorry, I should have asked. Your questions or comments? Okay, I'm going to hand it over. Thank you very much.
I'm very excited to be here. I've seen the list of talks that have been at these conferences in the past, wished that I could get to one, and here I finally am. So very happy to be here. I work at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. It's a mid-sized liberal arts school. We also have some graduate programs, and I teach in the physics department. And so the PythonTeX package that I'm going to be talking about is sort of coming out of my work as a physics professor. And you might notice that apparently something horrible happened to my slide here. This was actually on purpose because one of the things I'm going to be talking about is typesetting of computer code. I give a lot of handouts to my students, and I actually had a talk once when I had some code and it went off the side of the slide and somehow I missed that. And so one of the things that I've spent a lot of time on over the last year or so is working on ways to work with some of the code typesetting so that if you want it, you have the option to actually automatically wrap the lines around. This is not something that I would really recommend typically for slides, but I think I can probably get away with it since I'm actually talking about that. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of introduction to PythonTeX in case you're not familiar with the package, and then I'll get on to the code typesetting and a couple of the other things that I mentioned in my abstract. This goes back to about 2011 when I was getting started with it, and what I was really going for is there are a lot of Python libraries for doing science, and as a physicist I find that really useful, and I'd like a way to really tie that in closely with my LaTeX documents. And so what this allows us to do is we can bring in the package, then there's a PyCode environment. All the Python code that's inside that environment gets executed. Anything that you print or send a standard out then goes back into your tech document directly. And so we send this through a three-step compile process. The first step is saving all the code to a temp file. Second stage executes all the code. Third stage brings all the executed output back in. We get something like this, and it's just the equivalent of running that code, sticking the output directly in the document, and then it gets typeset. And that's just pure code execution. There are also ways to get a little bit fancier. There's a PyBlock environment, and what that's going to do is typeset the code, and the code is actually going to be run through the Pigments library for Python, so that provides syntax highlighting, and it uses the fancy verb package behind the scenes for the actual code layout. And with this block environment, it's not going to put the printed content or the standard out directly in the document unless you want that, so there's a print PythonTeX command for bringing that back in. And then if we create some variables within the code, we can access those values later on with the py command. So we run that through the system, get something like this back, we get our typeset code, syntax highlighting from Pigments, and then we can access the variable value. And the things that I do, I like to generate randomized assignments, use matplotlib, some of the other Python plotting libraries, and that's great for me because I can just toss some code in my document, get a plot and final output, and then if I realize, oh, I need to change this assignment from last year, my plotting code's right there in the document, so it makes it really easy to update and work with. A couple of final notes about PythonTeX before I get on to the work I've been doing with code typesetting. There are some commands for working just with verbatim content if you don't want to actually execute any code. So there's a pyverbatim and then a command for inline form. There's also some more or less equivalents of the commands that you would get in the minted package. I actually have maintained the minted package for the last couple of years, but this goes back before that. But there are those available, and also if any of you like the idea of this approach, but Python just isn't your language, at this point I'm up to 6 languages, just had some pull requests that allowed me to add Rust support, so a compiled language over the last few weeks, and I'm working on simplifying the system for adding additional languages, so this is definitely growing. At some point I may have to figure out something besides PythonTeX to call it, because it's going to, well, at some point we're going to hit a limit. I'm going to have to think about how to deal with that. But to focus in a little bit more on the code typesetting aspect, this is the list of, well, sort of the timeline for the fancy verb package, which is used behind the scenes by PythonTeX and also minted for doing the code typesetting. And we have the first release in '98. We have a few minor bug fixes and a few additional features since then. And I think that really speaks to the stability and the quality of the code for working with fancy verbatim material. But unfortunately, what I'm trying to do with PythonTeX, and then now that I'm maintaining minted, it's going a little bit beyond fancy verbatim, and that can cause some bad things to happen. So it's been a really wonderful package, but I do need some additional features for what I'm trying to do now. And I've just recently released what I'm calling FV Extra, Fancy Verb Extra features, essentially. And this is basically adding some additional features on top of Fancy Verb, especially for what I need with code typesetting. And everything that I'm going to be mentioning over the next few slides, it's already in PythonTeX and it's already in minted. And I think most of this would actually work with listings if you use the built-in features to bring in Fancy Verb. The first thing that it's going to do is use the upquote package and some of those kinds of features by default. The standard verbatim treatment is to treat the backtick and the single typewriter quote, well, in the normal LaTeX fashion, turn those into curly quotation marks, and that's really bad if I'm handing out code to students. They're going to be thinking I somehow went in and actually typed in the curly quotation marks, and then what is Python or some other language going to do with that? So the default that this is going to switch things to is that we actually do have our backtick and our typewriter single quotation mark, but there is a new curly quotes option if you do still need to, for some reason, get back to the original behavior. I've also worked a bit on mathematics within verbatim. One of the things that the Pigments syntax highlighting library allows is mathematics within comments to be typeset. And at least as a physicist, I like the idea of I'm writing some code, I can stick some math in a comment, have that typeset when I hand out to students, and that can be useful. But in the default behavior that Fancy Verb gives us, we see some extra spaces showing up. We also end up with the teletype font if we're going to use the text command from AMS Math packages, some of those kinds of things. So I've worked on the treatment of mathematics within Verbatim, and I think there are probably still some problems left, but I think we're at least getting pretty close to what you would get if you weren't in the Verbatim context. I also had a lot of fun in getting the single quote to turn into the correct prime instead of giving horrible, fatal error messages, but that does finally work for the few of you who might want to actually play with that. One of the things that Fancy Verb does compared to some of the other packages for working with Verbatim is it actually gives you tab stops. So it's not just going to take a tab, turn it into, say, 8 spaces or 4 spaces, whatever you want. It'll actually set tab stops, and then whatever combination of spaces and tabs you have, jump to the next tab stop. And there's this somewhat clever, really nice algorithm for doing that. Unfortunately, with the highlighted code, everything breaks. And it's not uncommon to have whole lines just vanish because it was trying to do tab expansion if you have it in the obey tabs mode. So I've actually re-implemented part of that, and it's now possible to have, say, multi-line strings that are indented with tabs. The tabs will no longer cause those to vanish. And I've also, while I was in there doing that, got some other things working. So there's now a tab option. You can actually use custom symbols, and variable width symbols like the right arrow fill will now actually work instead of being crunched into the width of just a single character. And then while I was in there, I also just added a tab color. So if you really want fancy color tabs, probably a bad idea, but you do have the option. I just wanted, while I was in there, get it done and then not look at it again. It was somewhat painful. I did horrible things with spaces and tabs in terms of redefinitions, but hopefully no one will have to worry about that for a while. Another thing that's now possible is if you have some code that you're typesetting and you want to emphasize some lines, there's a highlight lines option with an associated color option. And this is not the default color. The default color is a light blue. The bright yellow, well, I wanted something that would show up regardless of the projector, although that may not have been quite as successful as I was hoping. But in any case, you do have the option to highlight either single lines or ranges of lines. And if you really want to have lots of fun, there are some macros that are for the first line in the range, last line in the range, all the intermediate lines. So if you want to redefine some of those, you could actually do fancy things, say a line at the beginning, a line at the end, some different colors in between. But at least the default, I think for most purposes, should be pretty adequate. Now to move on to the line breaking work that I've been doing, and this is where I've spent the majority of my time. This is the situation that I ran into in a conference talk a few years back where I had somehow missed the width of things, and I'd actually, well, there was basically a space character right at the margin, and so I had things that had fallen off the slide, and then people were asking me, does that code really work? And well, it does if you could see all of it, but somehow that didn't quite come through. So by default, this new break lines option is going to be false because ideally I would hope that if you're going to typeset the code, think about it. Maybe you can actually do the line breaks yourself, make it fit within the 80 characters or whatever you need for your particular case. But if you are dealing with a situation where you do need the option to wrap things around, you can switch that, and then it'll bring those around. I have these right hook arrows by default, but there are options to customize that. And it'll actually detect the indentation of the line that's being wrapped around, and then it'll indent to that same depth, add a little bit of extra space for whatever your symbol is for wrapping around. And you can certainly customize all that, but this is sort of the default behavior. This may be a bit hard to see at the bottom for those of you who are off to the side, but if you do go through some of these break symbol left, break symbol right, you can do all kinds of fun things with the dingbats. Something that you probably don't want to get carried away with, but you do have the option if you have a, say, a particular look that you're going to be going for. So with break lines, that's going to just allow lines to wrap around at space characters. And the problem is, if someone decides to get excited and say do some DNA, and this is actually human DNA, you don't really have space characters. And again, this is probably a situation you should just go through by hand and do something. But if you don't want to do that, there are some additional options that I've built into the FB Extra package. There's a break before and a break after option. And with these, you can just specify either a single character or just a whole bunch of characters, and it'll allow breaks either before all those that you specify or after those. And in terms of some of the details with how this works, if you care about some of the more technical things, it's cat code independent. So if you decide that your, say, C character or T character here are going to be active and have some special definition, it doesn't really care about that. It's using detokenize behind the scenes. The other thing that it does by default is it's going to group all the identical characters together. So here I'm saying break after T, but actually it's not going to break after T unless it's the last T in any sequence of T's. And there's an option that you can change if you'd rather not keep all the T's together. So you've got some good options with that. Let's see. Another thing I should mention with this is that when I first put it together, I was not thinking about the PDFTeX engine treating UTF-8 multi-byte characters at the byte level, so the code point level, and that led to some pain, but it does correctly work now. So whenever it hits the first byte in a multi-byte UTF character under PDFTeX, it will look ahead, grab the entire sequence of bytes for that code point, and do the right thing. So it still works in that case. But with all those options, at least for what I do, handouts with code for students, it's vastly improved what I can do, and I hope it'll be useful for others as well. I gave you a little bit of an introduction to PythonTeX, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about one of the new features that I've just recently added that allows us to work around some of the problems that at least myself and some of my friends have often run into with this. And if we're thinking about some of the, say, commands that are provided by the PGF package for drawing, in this case I'm just making a simple little angle here. If we have all our information about our coordinates, we can just type that in, get our figure. This is a sort of simple figure, but generally be more complex, and go from there. One thing that would be possible to do, though, is using the code execution by PythonTeX, we could actually compute the coordinates of the points that we're going to be drawing between. And sort of the default for doing something like that would be maybe at the beginning we could calculate where our point's going to be, have that be in the variable p. Down here further, use the py command, which allows us to bring in variable values, and then we've got our location of the final point. Unfortunately, between the way that the picture environment and the way that PythonTeX works, you start getting these kinds of errors. And you could try to dig into this, figure out exactly where the conflict is coming from, but there are several sort of situations where these kinds of things can happen. So ideally there'd be a way to get around this, and we wouldn't have to worry about tokenization games and cat codes and all the rest of the fun. If you're going to take the primitive approach, and this is what I've had to do a lot until recently, which I don't like, but we could actually just within Python do the math calculation, have some multi-line string for a template, and then actually print that, and that gets it back in the document. And since Python sees everything first, we don't run into any problems with the result. Of course, the problem here is that now we have the LaTeX code within the string, and if we're not going to use a raw string, we're going to have to backslash escape our backslashes. And if we're going to do Python's templating, we have to double all the curly braces. And this is just going downhill way too fast. I really do not like the level of pain involved. So what I've done is created, well, it does work, but what I've done to try to get around some of that is I've created a new environment, which I'm calling PySub, for variable substitution. And what this is essentially doing is everything within the environment is being treated either for, well, variable substitution, string interpolation. And so anytime we have an exclamation mark, pair of curly braces, everything between that is going to be treated as an expression. In this case for Python, the same thing works for the other languages that are supported. That expression is evaluated, get the result back in the document. And so in this case, we have the exclamation mark, curly braces with the P. The value of P is pulled in from the earlier code, and then we get back to our result. And in terms of the exclamation mark with the braces, no special reason for that. The sort of standard $ symbol name or $ braces around the symbol, since that already has sort of tech meaning, that would probably be a bad idea. But in the future, I may provide some ways to customize the symbols if you do want to do that. There's also a command form of this. I don't think this will be as useful, but you can do some things. What I'm doing here is taking some, well, what will ultimately be verbatim text, but then I'm substituting the value for the X here, and then getting that typeset at the end. I had mentioned a couple of things at the end of my abstract about supporting additional languages, partially for time constraints in terms of the talk, and also because I had way too much fun with tabs over the summer. Some of that isn't quite finished, but just to give you sort of a sense of where some of this will be going in the future, if you are interested in adding support for your favorite language beyond what's already supported. Currently, you do have to do some Python coding to add a new language. This right here that I'm showing, that's what's required just to get basic bash support. But what I'm working toward, and I do have a proof of concept working, we'll just have to see what soon turns out to actually be. But working to get to the point where you can just drop a config file, and I'll probably just support a bunch of standard formats for that, but just drop that in some languages directory someplace, and then it'll just automatically find it, load out of that config file. You won't have to edit any Python, and that'll keep the system a little bit simpler if you do have other languages that you'd like to add in. The other thing that I'd mentioned was working with interactive programs, because everything so far, except for a sort of special case with the Python console, is essentially just you have your code. It's going to be saved to a temporary file that's executed. But I also do have a proof of concept working for capturing the output of interactive programs. And so what we'll be getting to is the possibility of, say, put in some commands that you'd like to run through maybe the interactive Ruby shell. Those are going to be sent out as long as you can communicate through pipes and you can predict the encoding that's going on, get those executed, get the output back in the document. And so essentially you'll have an interactive session that's saved and preserved in the document. And at least with a lot of the things that I do teaching physics, if I can show the students, here's the code that you sent through the interactive program, here's what you should be getting back, that's going to make my life a lot simpler. So both of those, I have code working, but to refine that and get it actually out, we'll have to see what happens with that. Like I said, tab expansion and some related things, way too much fun over the summer. But in any case, that's what I have, and I may be a little bit biased about saying don't typeset without FE extra, but at least as far as I'm concerned for my own work, I really need to do that, and I do hope that all the line-breaking features and highlighting and improved math within comments, for those of you who do need to typeset code, will be a significant improvement. Thank you.
I see that the value of a Python variable is kept across environments. Mm-hmm. So what do you do for included files? So suppose, for example, I calculate the value of Python variable in included file 1, and I need it in included file 2. Mm-hmm. So include only, I just can't use include only at that point.
Right. With the current setup, everything that you're going to use, you do have to include during the compile. Yeah. So in a case like that, what I would typically do is I'd probably, everything that needs to be shared, pre-compute that, And then actually, there are some other features that I didn't get into, but there are ways that you can specify at the beginning of a document, regardless of what you might include, that you want to have certain things pre-calculated. So you might do something like that, and then if it's pre-calculated at the beginning, you'd have access to it, or maybe save it in some sort of intermediate format and bring it into the other document. Yeah.
You said string interpolation and substitution. I think the question popped in my mind about macros, because there used to be a package that gave true macros, synthetic macros in Python, but only Python.
Okay.
And I was wondering, can you dynamically substitute strings inside the Python code so that you get the effect of syntactic macros or something like that? Because of the use of programs in the
So you're thinking about once the typeset code's coming back into the tech document, there would still be macros in that would be expanded?
yeah.
There's no reason in principle that couldn't be done. The level of pain involved, I'm not sure about that part.
So maybe that's not the right way.
Well, at least at this point, it's not the right way for me to try it. If someone wants to have way too much fun, but given just the level of pain that I went through getting the tabs working,
Yeah.
at some point we have to weigh the trade-offs. Yeah.
I have a
Yes.
question. Would you like to maintain fancy verb? I mean, because it seems like you could at least put the bug fixes back in there.
Well, if that was worth doing, I would be willing to think about it, but I guess the one concern that I've had with this is that because it's been around for so long with so few changes, my guess is that there's a lot of code out there that relies on the internals. And to do some of this patching, I have to redefine some of the internals. So I'm still using the same names, but if you have, say, some patch that you wrote way back, then there's that potential breakage. So
We should talk about that.
yeah, it'd be worth thinking about.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Stefan? But that's okay. Pavneet was worried about catering, so he asked me to introduce the rest of the morning speakers. And Stefan is here for part 1, Tech and Industry 1, programming Cisco switches using tech. Officially from Lufthansa Industry Solutions. Quite an intriguing affiliation. Are you good? We'll find out.
Yes.
Yay.
Thanks. I'm Stefan. Yes, I'm working for Lufthansa, the airline, and I build and maintain cruise ships. I like this combination for traveling. Yes, actually I'm working for Lufthansa Industry Solutions. We deal with a lot of topics like a lot of us are consultants. We deal with big data, cloud, software, BI, SAP, project management, anything you have in industry, and in all kinds of industries. So we are not just a partner of Lufthansa itself, but also for different kinds of industry. We have to earn money, not just to take it from our mother company. So we are partners of logistic companies, healthcare, hospitals, and my part is actually our hospitality sub-department. We make software and hardware for cruise ships, hotels, buses, and even trains, infotainment solutions. And I do networks, so I have more options for traveling even. Yes, and I focus on cruise ships since I have got that history. I was traveling on cruise ships for many years as IT and communication officer. Then I decided to go to Lufthansa to see more cruise ship companies. So I should change something, I think. Let's see. To get it full screen again. This looks better. Okay, that's a typical working place for me. Sometimes traveling. In the meantime, more at yards, building and construction shipyards. And a typical cruise ship now today got about 3,000 passengers, 1,000 crew members. And they are smaller, they are bigger, but that's a typical size. That's the last one I finished. I don't build the whole cruise ships, but the network. I configure and design and implement the networks. It doesn't mean that I put in all the cables and the switches, but once they are inside, I get my hands on it a bit remotely. So on such a big ships, we have a lot of equipment to get into the network. It's like a small city with a lot of technic and security things. So we got thousands of TVs and fixed phones, desk phones, mobile phones, a lot of cameras running for security. Even clocks are digital and on the Ethernet today. Nautical systems, safety equipment, and a lot, thousands of devices and hundreds of networks. And this all has to be configured somehow and designed in a safe or secure way, separating networks, guest networks from infotainment or security, safety ship networks. So we got usually hundreds of IP networks, interfaces. We have to deal with very complex configurations and also have to deliver high performance. So in such a ship, we usually have redundant data centers. I don't need to show pictures. I think a data center on a ship looks like a data center everywhere. We have core switches, big and strong, with about 5,000 lines of configuration on the other ship I showed. And we have a lot of smaller distribution switch stacks with hundreds of ports to be configured, also hundreds of configuration lines, sometimes thousands of cabin switches, small switches, 8 or 12 ports. They also need configuration. So I try to automate it, to generate and to program and to use scripts to roll out configurations, to update, to implement changes. And for all of this, we need to have a good way for the rollout and also for the documentation. We don't get a payment from the customer until we deliver the full documentation. So, and we usually have more than one ship. Some customers have up to 100 cruise ships, like a big American cruise ship corporation. So I don't want to repeat everything from scratch. That's why I don't. I automate it and I make it variable. So new ship, I change some macros and regenerate all the configurations. Such customers also prefer standardization. Usually when we start with such projects, we look at several ships of the same type of construction. Also the customer wants to have the possibility to maintain it in a good way. in an efficient way. So we have workshops, we discuss with the customer and make suggestions, speak about VLANs and subnets, and have big Excel lists of IP addresses. And for ship 2, 3, 4, we use exactly the same. We just change the IP range, and the segmentation all is the same, configuration is the same. So I can clone ships. But back to creating configurations. I will show how it looks like. This is just some code I took from eTech to obey spaces and line ends, because when I generate configs, I generate it with white spaces also, and you can see it on the next slide. This is a small part of an interface configuration. I have to repeat for many interfaces. Let's say on a ship, I have a lot of switch stacks over the whole ship, like 30 electrical rooms, and every segment of the ship has its own subnet, and each subnet needs an interface and the core switch. So I have to generate such interface configurations, even a bit longer in every situation, for each subsystem, maybe 30 times. And for a lot of subsystems, this is how the configuration finally looks like on the switch. If I make a show config, I get this output, and I want to generate this output. And this is what I do in loops with variables. I prefer PGF loops, since I use PGF anyway for drawings, and generating the config by writing it with some dummy macro, making a loop over it, and generating some pages, and finally thousands of lines. We don't have just only network interfaces, but also switch ports. A switch has 48 ports. We have stacks of many switches and ships with thousands of them. And well, this is the way where I save the most time blowing up configurations. And as shown, it bases on making space and the end-of-line character active to be obeyed. I get a PDF from this. I can make copy and paste, or my colleagues can work with copy and paste to the device, but it's also written into a file that we can import or roll out via TFTP. So that's part of my package, which does the same, just writing out to a file, so I don't have to deal with a PDF if I don't want to. And you saw it for workshops, discussions, or for documentation. I better have pretty printing, kind of a syntax highlighting. It's much better readable than 5,000 lines of this code. That's why we also use the listings package for emphasizing keywords, for visualizing positive and negative statements to easier see them, for grouping things, and of course it has to be very easy. I don't want to touch configs or adjust them. I just import them into a ready-made tech document, and you can see it's most of you know the listings package. I just set the keywords, a lot more keywords of course, kinds of keywords, apply some styles, color, underlining. At the bottom you see I color numbers this way, digits actually, including the dot for highlighting IP addresses. And this is what the results looks like, with underlining and separate the interfaces. I can see my keywords and the positive keywords like permit, allowed, trust, negative keywords like deny. I can see my IP addresses, and it's good for discussing in workshops, for having online meetings where we discuss configurations with the customer network engineers. And as it's a bit hard to speak about 5,000 lines of configuration to scroll, I index them. That's also very simple with the listings package. I just say, hey, index all keywords. I input the original file and print the index. I use the IMAC index, IMAC IDX package, because I don't need to run make index separately. That's also easier for my colleagues to work with it. Just one compiler run, and it's indexed, and my 5,000 lines got a keyword index. And so if I speak with a customer about NTP settings or DNS or some function, I just click in the index and I'm at the place where I want to be without much scrolling. Customers like it. They are not used to it. So if they see a bit more readable, legible documentation, they are impressed. And that's an easy and quick win. We also use bookmarks in long documentation where we can click and scroll immediately to important config parts. Well, and to make it even easier and reusable for us, I also calculate IP addresses, subnets, ranges. Subnetting and calculating can be a bit laborious. You have a big IP range, you split it into subnets of different size. The network can only start at certain positions. It's binary. So you do it by hand or with a subnet calculator or in the head and type it in. It's a bit laborious too. So I use an IP address calculation tool. I found one that did it in Lua, so I don't need to make it myself. Maybe next time I make it in Python. Well, this I just have some Lua functions for where I input an IP address, a subnet mask, or a size, and it puts all values to be calculated in macros, which I then can use in my configurations, in the documentation, in drawings. And you can imagine if I have a big drawing showing routing and IP addresses for routing gateways, I just changed the IP range, and all subnets and all information is recalculated, drawing, compiled, and have the next chip ready. It works like any Lua tag. I embed my Lua tag functions in a Lua code environment. It uses text.sprint to set values into tag macros that I can use. And all of this together convinces my boss to allow me to use tech and to force my colleagues to use tech. And I must also say customers are very interested in understanding how this is done, especially if they see it live, generating code, generating a drawing. In my next talk I will show some drawings, and it's good. You sit in the workshop, they expect to see a big visual diagram of all the network, and you plug in your laptop. It shows a lot of hacking code, loops. It looks like cool code. You just press the green button and it compiles, scrolls a bit, and the big picture appears. And they are usually impressed to see that it's programmed and not just it's clicked together. So, all in all, it saves me a lot of time, gives me some quick wins, and why I came to use tech, or to convince my boss that we should use tech. It's very natural. We generate tag or PDF files, tags. We blow up configs by macros. We do macro expansion. That is tag. We repeat many things. We calculate addressing and count things. We work with imported Excel data via CSV with data tools, because we have a lot of big Excel files for rollout, for documenting each device, IP addresses, network positions, cable numbers, and so on. Tech works cross-platform, so it works on my Mac, on any Windows laptop of my colleague, and on a server, because sometimes I need to SSH into servers and do my work there. It supports version control. We have a single software for documentation, drawings, for configuring, and it makes reusing very simple, and also backwards. If I'm at ship 3 or 4 and improved my documentation, my styles, my drawings, I regenerate all for the previous ships and hand over the documentation again, and the customer is even more happier. So altogether it improves over time. Yeah, and that's why I use tech for it. Thanks.
I will have a lot of questions about drawings, but I understand it's a second part. So I will ask you a meta question. In a place I worked some time ago, which was a programming place, there was a rule. We use any tool or any language if we have at least 2 experts on this language. So if one leaves, another one can take. So my question, how could, do you have somebody else in your place which understands tech? Or did you, or were you able to convince boss that you are not going to leave and you are going to support this thing yourself?
Both. Well, we got educated people, and educated people are often coming from universities, and in academic you use tech, so people usually know tech.
And they can do your packages, yes, they can work with the code themselves.
Yes, we are a very small team for the network, so we can use it internally, and we have our discussion from desk to desk. Mostly, at the moment, mostly I am using it, and if other people don't want, they can do their work manually, walking by foot, and I fly and save time, getting more things done. Yes, I also have to provide sometimes Word or Visio documents, like my boss gets a PDF and says, hey, I want the Visio code. I want to make a frame around it or change the frame I made. He wants to edit it. Well, I have to convert it there.
How do you do this? How do you convert?
Inkscape. I can That's also a topic of my next talk, to export drawings to Visio.
Okay. Thank you.
I've got a sort of very generic question. I often find myself saving 2.5 minutes between 4 hours of programming. And then 10 years later, it's paid itself off. What's your experience with that phenomenon?
It's the same. Sometimes I could write 2 lines, or I make a for each loop for 2 things. Programming is fun. It's also motivating to do things. A lot of drawings, what I will show in my next talk, they would not exist, I think, if I have to do it with Visio and clicking, but being allowed to program it and to develop it this way, it's more fun and more motivating to do it. So sometimes things would not exist if we could do the easy way. If we do the challenging way, it's part of the fun and also part of the competence you show to your boss or your customers. Yeah.
Thank you.
How do you test this? How do you make sure that you don't hand out the same configuration twice? Something?
Could you repeat the question, please?
How do you test the whole thing?
Before we deliver all the equipment to the ship, we build nearly the whole ship except the small cabin switches in our staging area. I could, to answer this question, at least show a picture which should come for my next talk. Just a picture. How it looks like. That's my office. That's my testing. And this too. So before we bring the hardware into a ship, we build all in our offices, cable it, roll out configurations, and make thorough tests, make performance tests. We build, we put 100 TVs or more there. Of the first chip, where we made the whole network and infotainment solution, we built all in the warehouse, all cabin equipment, 1,000 TVs, set-top boxes, phones, all switches, put into a big warehouse with expensive air condition and run tests over it. And in this environment, we usually still run tests. We have a factory acceptance test with customers and see that video runs, that redundancy works. We switch off arbitrary things like one core switch or one firewall and ensure that still all video streams, test streams are running, phones are running and not interrupted. There are several days of official tests with the customer before it gets even delivered to a yard. And of course, I don't want to run around in a big ship, 14 decks high, 300 meters long, and in a construction area it's a bit dark. The cables are at this position. You work with helmet and safety shoes. Some thousand workers are on the ship, and I don't want to run around too much. So I all pre-configure it here, test it, and then it gets shipped. Some people build it in, and at the later stage I come to the ship and make the final tweaks. But it's already configured in my office.
One more question, maybe? Yeah. I'm going to throw a wrench into the works. I work in static analysis in my day job. So the idea is we write code to examine automatically the code of our clients. With all due respect, I can't imagine writing any form of static analysis of tech macros. So although what you've done is very effective in the sense that you can very quickly end up with configurations, and on top of that you can print them out and produce the indexing. It It seems to me that a simpler programming language would be more effective in the sense that you could then go after the fact and go analyze it when it's been produced.
Sure, you could use any programming language. I use the one I know, and I like the combination of using the same for the documentation. They have just one tool for all. And TUG can do it, so I do it. I could do the same with Python or something, but then I end up maybe with a mix. Not everybody understands every programming language.
So you're saying the unity of programming language, in this case the TUG macros, the fact that it automatically produces output, visible output, is very effective.
It's effective, and actually I didn't invest much thought into it. It was just coming from the need to generate a lot of configuration code. People I know, other network engineers, they put this interface configuration code into an Excel, mark all, click and draw, and Excel does an automatic calculation, like counting up things, counting up IP addresses. But I noticed it's not very capable this way, because you have to count in different ways what Excel cannot do, like counting IP addresses and subnets upwards in steps, and not counting up the last digit, but digits in the middle, like the network number. And so I saw Excel is not the best tool, so I need something what does programming, and I thought of macros, and there I was with TUG.
I don't think John could analyze Excel and Excel clicks in his static analysis.
No, I don't want to.
However, you have a quick one?
Did you ever thought about doing some formal verification of your input, output, whatever? I mean, you are delivering this, and this is a huge amount of money that is invested. Formal verification of systems like this that are closed. I mean, that's a nice thing. You have a very closed network. We have probably one link outside, well, probably two links outside, some backup, whatever. But at the end, the ship itself is a closed system. Is there anything like an idea of verification in this area?
It's verified when
Test-based verification.
yeah, not in an automated way. I push the configurations on sample switches and see if they are applied correctly or bring error messages. And it's, as a network engineer, you see if it's working. And of course, we
Or not.
Whether it's working.
If it doesn't work, do they fly you by helicopter to?
No, he
Well-
SSH into it.
yes, ships are usually working via satellite connection. We SSH into it. We make a remote maintenance updates. But if something happens, like I hack into it remotely and kick myself out, connection lost. I'm lucky that I work at Lufthansa and fly there immediately.
So sometimes we don't.
Okay, let's take the break and be back here at 10:30. Keep our 15-minute savings to be given to a certain speaker who shall remain nameless.
And then we see some